Hello, and welcome back to the Election Tricycle. I'm Emily Tamkin in Washington, D.C., and I'm joined as ever by Tom Hamilton in the UK.
Hello.
And Rohan Venkat, who is back in Cairo.
Hello.
Here at the Election Tricycle, we normally take our little tricycle around the world to the elections of 2024, and typically we focus on the United States, United Kingdom, and India, but sometimes the tricycle makes other stops, including this week when we'll be looking at France. And for this, I'm very pleased to share that we are joined by Art Goldhammer. He is an author and translator based at Harvard University's Center for European Studies and writes regularly at his blog and elsewhere on French politics. So Art, thank you for being with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
So just to start out, I think when President Macron first announced this election, it was understood to be a gamble. The European parliamentary elections had taken place. The far right did quite well. And I think there were some who saw this as him, I don't know, calling the country's bluff and you know, sort of calling the country's bluff with national parliamentary elections. What was your read on the idea that this is Macron's gamble, and how, you know, however many days later, however many weeks later, does it look like that gamble is paying off?
Well, my first reaction was that it was totally insane. My second reaction was that there might have been a little method to his madness because rumor had it that there would be a censure vote in the fall when the parliament returned. There was going to be a budget vote, and that was an occasion for the parties to come together and sanction Macron, who has become very unpopular in the country to the point of detestation. We can talk later about whether that hatred is warranted by what he's actually done, but the fact is that his popularity has plummeted. So there's no question that he was taking a risk, but in retrospect, it was a calculated risk, and it's the danger that lies behind that risk is one that he would have faced very likely in the fall, in any case, if he had done nothing.
The other sort of headline that we've seen thus far coming out of France is that this, well, actually, I have two questions for you before I let the others jump in. The first is there was an article in Time this week, and actually we can put it in the show notes to this episode, that was about, you know, Macron called this because of the far right, but actually it's had the sort of maybe paradoxical, maybe not effect of reviving the left, of bringing back the left. Can you speak a bit about what France's left-wing parties did in response to this call for snap elections, and why, if you believe that they've been revitalized, why you think that's been the case?
Well, that was perhaps the biggest surprise of the post-dissolution realignment, that the left got it back together. In 2022, after the presidential election, there was a parliamentary election, which resulted in the present parliament. And in that election, the left had organized itself into a new bloc, which at that point was called the NUPES, which stands for the New Popular Economic and Social Union. That union did not last much beyond the election of 2022. It took only about 6 months before it began to fall apart. It's an alliance against nature, if you like. The far left, led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, has taken fairly radical positions on, for example, the war between Israel and Gaza. He refused to call Hamas a terrorist organization, for example. He also wants to move to a sixth republic, to abolish the existing institutions of the Fifth Republic in France. So it's quite a radical party, and that radicalism separates it from the other components of what was then called the NUPES, which consisted of the Socialist Party, much diminished since its heyday in the early part of the 21st century, the Green Party, and the Communists. So that alliance fell apart, and Macron's calculation was that it would remain divided after he dissolved the parliament. But that was not the case. It took only 48 hours for what was called the New Popular Front to be resurrected from the ashes of the NUPES. The New Popular Front obviously harks back to the alliance of 1936, when the Socialist Party joined with the Communist Party to stop fascism, which was then in power in Italy and Nazi Germany. So the historical resonances of this name are perhaps far greater than what the current alliance actually represents. We can discuss that next. But that was Macron's calculation that there would not be a new popular front, that the left would not unite. And in fact, it did unite. Now, we'll see what that gives. At the moment, the polls are suggesting that the order of finish will be the Rassemblement National, that is the radical right, led by Marine Le Pen, with her candidate Jordan Bardella running for prime minister. They will finish first, according to the polls, with about 31 to 33% of the vote, followed by the New Popular Front, this new alliance on the left, with about 26, and then trailed badly by Macron's alliance, which has once again renamed itself. This time it's called Ensemble. Previously, it was Renaissance. Before that, it was En Marche. Why the parties keep changing names is one of the mysteries of French politics. In any case, that party is expected to finish third with about 20% of the vote. How that will translate into seats is an open question, which we can discuss. The reason it's an open question has to do with the complexities of the French electoral system.
I love the story of the changing party names. You've raised so many questions, but one thing that I did want to make sure that we touched on before I turn it to Tom and Rohan, there has been, or I have seen, much consternation from not all, but many, how to put this? I've seen many French Jews sort of raise the alarm because on the one hand, there's the far right, and on the other hand, there's the far left. And how seriously do these two groups take anti-Semitism? How seriously do they take it in the opposite way, right? Like how much are they sort of using anti-Semitism? You mentioned the war between, the Israel-Gaza war. What role is that? And what role is that playing in this election, if at all? And what do you think that this election will mean for anti-Semitism in France?
Well, it's playing a major role in this election. It played a major role in the characterization of the left, the far left, the La France Insoumise, which is the radical left component of this new left alliance, even before the dissolution, because Jean-Luc Mélenchon has, although I would not say he's an anti-Semite himself, he's been quite ambiguous about his attitude toward candidates who express a more openly anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist or anti-Israel position. There's a lot of dishonesty among all the parties about what exactly is being discussed. But the fact is that Mélenchon has courted as part of his electoral base the suburban populations in France. The French suburbs are largely inhabited by people who have immigrated to France, either recently or have descended from immigrants of a previous generation. There are many Muslims, many Arabs, many North Africans in those suburbs. And it has to be said that there's a great deal of anti-Israel sentiment in those areas. In trying to appeal to that anti-Israel sentiment, Mélenchon has courted ambiguity, right, and tried to maintain an open position on where he stands exactly on anti-Semitism, because he doesn't want to alienate that base. So that position has been exploited by his opponents, both in the center and on the far right. Now, the irony of this is, of course, that the far right party, the Rassemblement National, is descended from an openly anti-Semitic party.
Right.
It was headed by Jean-Marie Le Pen, the father of the current leader of the party. He's the man who is notorious for saying that the Holocaust was a minor detail of European history, for making a pun on crematory ovens. The name of a minister at the time was Dur. Four is French for oven. He made a pun on that minister's name. And he was expelled from his own party by his daughter when she took over on the grounds of anti-Semitism, a decision that he challenged in the courts and lost. So the French courts have found him literally guilty of anti-Semitism. So this is the party that is now accusing the far left of anti-Semitism.
Right.
And quite ironically, Serge Klarsfeld, the famous Nazi hunter who spent all of his life tracking down perpetrators of the Holocaust from the concentration camps, has said that if he is faced with a choice between a far left candidate and a far right candidate, he will vote for the far right candidate.
Oh, wow.
So for the descendant of Jean-Marie Le Pen and his co-founder, the RN was the Front National was co-founded by a member of the Waffen SS. So that's the irony of the anti-Semitism issue in this election.
We'll definitely maybe want to have a bit of time at the end to talk a little bit about cohabitation, election potential results, and so on. But before if we stick to the campaign here a little bit, one thing that comes to mind is turning, as you did just now, the attention on the far right. There has been, some talk. We talked a couple of weeks ago with folks about Europe and how the Meloni example has almost made it seem as if the RN could be something similar, that they would moderate their way into office. There's a sense that Macron is trying to push a sense of both sides being extremes and him in the center and equivalence between left and right. I'm curious how you see the appeal of the RN today, the far-right party, and also particularly that of Bardella, their prime ministerial candidate.
Yeah. Very good questions. There's no doubt that Marine Le Pen has succeeded in her campaign to de-demonize the party, as they call it in French. Meloni has been an example, although it's important to keep in mind that there are frictions between Meloni and Le Pen. They don't see eye to eye on all issues. Nevertheless, the example of Meloni has helped in the demonization campaign, because Meloni has shown that a far-right party can come to power and govern more or less normally, not alienate European allies, take a moderate position on Ukraine. She's been quite supportive of the EU position on Ukraine. So that's helped Marine Le Pen's argument that she has indeed changed the party. There's also no question that she's made inroads with the electorate. There are many people who formerly voted for the center-right party, which is called the Republicans, les Républicains, who are now quite openly saying they're going to vote for the RN because they're sick of Macron. So this has been a successful campaign. You're also right to bring up the name of Jordan Bardella, who is notable for being both young, 28 years old, politically a novice. He's never been elected to any office, is basically an appointee of Marine Le Pen, but someone behind whom she's thrown her entire weight. She's said publicly that he will become the prime minister, that she won't try to usurp that position for herself. He's been quite popular with younger voters. He's got a million or more followers on TikTok. I don't have the exact number at my fingertips, but he's availed himself of social media very successfully. He presents himself as quite a respectable figure. You rarely see him not wearing a suit, except when he's on TikTok, of course. He speaks articulately and politely. He generally treats his opponents in televised debates with a certain respect. In short, he's changed the image of the far right. When Jean-Marie Le Pen was head of the party, he's a man who wears an eye patch. He looked a bit like a pirate and had the reputation of being someone with a dagger between his teeth. And that's certainly not the image that Bardella has sought to project. So in that respect, the party has changed its image. The question that lies behind that one is, has it really changed its substance? And I think on that point, the answers are mixed and difficult to be firm or precise about. I think it has changed its substance on important issues like exiting the European Union. When Marine Le Pen ran for president in 2017 against Macron in his first race, she floated the idea of a Frexit, a French exit a la Brexit from the EU. That's been totally dropped from the platform. So in that respect, she's moved toward Meloni, normalizing the position of France with respect to radical changes in its international position. She was also once, at one time, closer to Russia than she at least claims to be now. In 2017, she went to Moscow and was photographed with Vladimir Putin. That photograph has resurfaced in this campaign in an attempt to discredit her. But she now says that she supports European Union aid for Ukraine in the war against Russia and so on. The one place where I think it's safe to say that the RN has not really changed is in its attitude toward immigration. It remains staunchly in favor of tighter restrictions. It wants to establish within the Schengen zone a new secondary border, which is really a contradiction in terms. It makes nonsense of what the Schengen zone is supposed to mean, and would end free circulation of people within the European Union. It wants to eliminate the what they call in French the droit du sol, the right to French citizenship for anyone who's born on French soil. It wants to bar access to French public offices, including civil service, to people who have double nationality. All of those would be radical changes in France's current policy, and the likelihood is that they would be rejected by the Constitutional Council as unconstitutional. So Marine Le Pen, or the RN, if it comes to power, could have the best of both worlds. It could maintain its radical position on anti-immigration and yet be prevented from actually doing anything by the Constitutional Council. So it can say to its voters, we tried, but we couldn't do it. And to those who are hostile to it because of its anti-immigration attitudes, can say, well, nothing actually changed, so what are you complaining about?
Can I ask a bit about we've mentioned, and it's universally accepted, that calling the election in the first place was a gamble on the part of Macron. This is a campaigning question, really. What did he want the election to be about, and what has it ended up being about in terms of where the national debate is focused?
Yeah. Well, I think he wanted the election to be about what the previous two presidential elections were about, and namely, do you want the radical right to come to power, or do you want a moderate technocratic government which is going to continue along the path that France has been led for the last 20 years by the parties of the center right and the center left, which I, Macron, have replaced. And I have eliminated the contradictions between those two parties, or the feigned contradictions between them, and replaced them with what they both always agreed about, which is that France needs a certain number of structural economic reforms to maintain its competitiveness in a globalized economy. So that's what he wanted the election to be about. That didn't work out because he failed to recognize, as I said at the outset, how unpopular he has become. Now, the reasons for that unpopularity, I personally think the unpopularity has turned to hatred, and that hatred is excessive. But we can analyze the reasons why unpopularity has turned to hatred. One has to do, I think the principal reason is the retirement reform, which was pushed through without a majority in parliament. There's a provision of the French Constitution called Article 49.3, which allows under certain circumstances laws to be passed without a majority. If the government invokes its responsibility, calls for a vote of confidence, and if they fell on that vote of confidence, then they're turned out of office. So it dramatizes the stakes in the vote on a particular law. So he used that not only in passing retirement reform, but in other previous reforms, which were unpopular reforms, but not unpopular to the point of bringing down a government. Nevertheless, his repeated recourse to that method of governing made it more credible for his opposition on both the right and the left to say he's an anti-democratic authoritarian president. So that's one reason for his unpopularity. The other simply has to do with his personality. I think it's not unfair to say that he's arrogant, narcissistic, and in some ways, well, you called it a gamble. He's been a gambler ever since he was an investment banker. When he was an investment banker doing mergers and acquisitions, he made big gambles. I can tell you other stories, but it would take us too far afield about the ways he gambled. But one that I'm sure remains in the mind of everyone who follows politics is the way that he quit a very high position in François Hollande's government in order to run against his mentor and protector, François Hollande, for the presidency. And that's how he got where he was. He took a major gamble with his own career, and he wound up where he was. So he's a risk taker. Now, some people would say that risk taking when you're president of the Republic of a great power, a central player in the European Union, is not just being a gambler, but it's being juvenile, rash, ill-advised to the point of recklessness. And I think many people in France feel that way now. If he was hated before, he's now reviled because he's plunged France into this crisis from which no one can see the exit at this point.
So does that mean that the other parties are pushing this campaign as almost a referendum on Macron himself rather than on other substantive issues?
Yes, that's quite true. On the one hand, it's a referendum on Macron. On the other hand, it's a referendum on how you see the RN. Is it a fascist party? Is it a radical right party? Or has it normalized itself to the point where it can no longer be called those things? It can no longer be excluded from what they call the Republican arc, the parties that have a legitimate claim on ruling France.
It's interesting because there's so much of what you were saying that reminded me of conversations that we've had on this podcast about the United States or about India, where just beating back the right, or just making sure that everybody is able to live as a full member of the society is not enough, right? We've seen for many people to go out and vote the way you might want them to. But it sounds like in France, there's this added layer of real contempt for the person who's making that argument.
Yes, I think that's true. There's one additional factor that I left out, which is that apart from Macron's personality, he also stands as a symbol for a certain class within French society, which I will call the technocratic elite. Many of the high positions in French government are monopolized by people who attended a few schools, Sciences Po, the school that trains nominally political scientists, but it's almost an essential to go there if you want to become a member of the French civil service, and the École Nationale d'Administration, which trains most of France's high civil servants. Macron embodies that world to a T. He attended those schools. He was a top student. In his remarks, off the cuff remarks, when he meets with people in the street, he often exudes the self-confidence that goes with that class. So, for example, he once met two unemployed men who were telling him how difficult it was to find a job. And he said, "That's nonsense. I can cross the street and find a job in 5 minutes." Well, that's true for him.
Right.
He's a graduate of France's top schools, but not true for the people he's talking to. And he seems to have no ability to feel empathy for people who don't belong to that group. He once said that the rest of France will be pulled up by those who are the climbers at the top of the rope, les premiers de cordée in French. So he likened himself to, the master mountain climber who's at the head of the chain, and everyone else in France is hanging from this rope precariously over the chasm. And if he doesn't pull hard enough, they're all going to fall into the abyss. So it's a rejection of that class as well as of Macron personally that I think is at work here.
And that rejection, or at least that unhappiness with Macron, doesn't seem to be just coming from either the far right or the far left, or the left in general, but within his own coalition as well, right? There's a sense that even Attal is his own prime minister is trying to seek a different path to show some separation from Macron, the hated personality.
Yes, quite true. Many of the people who are now running on the ensemble ticket do not include on their campaign posters that they're part of the presidential majority, as it used to be called. They don't mention the name Macron. They say, with Gabriel Attal, the prime minister. And Attal himself is using as his campaign slogan, elect me to the prime ministership this time. The last time I was chosen, I was nominated. And that's true. He was nominated by Macron. Now he wants to have an independent legitimacy by being elected in his own name. So essentially, this legislative election has turned into a kind of pseudo-presidential election, where what is being contested is the personal legitimacy of the leaders of the two major parties. I mean, I shouldn't really call them major parties because the Ensemble Party is now third. The other issue is, of course, who will embody the legitimacy of the left coalition if it should win. And that's where there's a major kerfuffle, even within the left, over Mélenchon's position, because Mélenchon is viscerally rejected by many who associate themselves with the Socialist Party or the Greens or the Communists. So there's been ambiguity about who will become the prime minister should, by some miracle, the left finish first. I think it will not be Mélenchon because he's such a divisive figure, but it could be someone from within his group, such as François Ruffin, who's tried to put some distance between himself and Mélenchon. Or it could be Clémentine Autain, who is a less well-known, but within the LFI party is fairly prominent. So there are a number of possibilities.
We must remind listeners that this is also a complex election. Maybe if you could just tell us what happens next, because it's not as simple as whoever wins on Sunday. There's another round to come afterwards, and there's a lot of calculations that will happen after that.
Right, exactly. So France's legislative elections are a two-round affair. After the first round, the two top finishing candidates proceed to the second round. Plus, there's a possibility that if a third candidate gets more than 12.5% of the registered voters in the district, not of the votes actually expressed, but of the registered voters, that third candidate can proceed as well. So you can have a triangular election. It's even possible to envision quadrangular elections, but those are very rare. So the question is, what happens in the case of triangular? Who will one of the three candidates drop out? So there are now petitions being circulated trying to get the parties to commit. So trying to get the Ensemble Party, that is the centrist party, to drop out if it's third place in a triangular election, so that you'll have a direct head-on confrontation between the far right and the far left. So far, the centrists have not committed to that. In the first round, the far left chose single candidates to represent it in each district rather than allow a socialist, say, to run against a France Insoumise candidate. So you wouldn't have the left dividing the vote. That has worked in almost all districts. There are a few where Mélenchon, exercising his authoritarian control over his own group, expelled people who were internal opponents of his within the party, people he's been trying to get rid of for a long time but hadn't been able to. But now he's expelled them from the party. So in retaliation, the other members of his ostensible coalition, the New Popular Front, allowed them to run on the New Popular Front ticket against the LFI candidate, which has caused some consternation within the coalition. So that just shows you the kinds of frictions that exist and the kind of complexities that may be perpetuated into the second round. And then it has to be said that at the end of the second round, it's still very likely that we won't have a majority. Barthelard of the far right has said that he will not become prime minister unless his party has an absolute majority. Now, there's a proviso to that ultimatum, which is that what's left of the center-right, we haven't even discussed the split in the center-right party, but that fractured not down the middle, but along the extreme right line. The leader of the party, Eric Ciotti, has thrown in his lot with Marine Le Pen and has been given a certain number of seats within the RN coalition to run his own candidates. So if he gets enough votes, he could make the difference to make up an absolute majority for the RN. Still, I think that's unlikely. So if the RN does not get an absolute majority, then the ball is back in Macron's camp. He has a number of choices. He could turn to the left to try to name a prime minister with a coalition that would need some support from parties of the center. At the moment, Macron and Attal both are trying to characterize the Popular Front as a party of the extreme left. So it's hard to see how they can turn around and say, we can now accept you into our coalition, but they might do that. I mean, self-contradiction is always a part of politics. So they could do that. Or Macron could try to appoint a technocratic government, a caretaker government, like the one that led Italy under Mario Monti or Mario Draghi. That's a possibility. And then there's a possibility under the French Constitution of having an even more limited government where basically people from civil society, academics and functionaries would be appointed to run the government with limited powers, being able to make to govern simply by administrative order, what we would call executive orders in the United States, but only on a limited number of topics. Any of those solutions would tend to be highly unstable. If you had a coalition government, it would be subject to the toppling of the government by a no confidence vote, as occurred often in the Fourth Republic. And Macron is barred by the Constitution from dissolving Parliament again for 1 year. And then the final possible solution to a no-majority government, a hung Parliament, would be a Macron resignation. There will be a lot of pressure on him as the person who precipitated this crisis to get out of the way and allow politics to be reconstituted from the ground up with a new presidential election, with the danger that this time Marine Le Pen could win.
Wow. So we have fractures, frictions, caveats, moving parts, pressure. Art, before we let you go, we have a section called Tricycle Recommends, where we each suggest an article or a podcast or a video for our listeners. And we were hoping that you could tell our listeners a bit about your blog and where they can read more of your, because I wish we could speak to you for 2 hours. So could you speak a bit about where our listeners can read more of your insights?
Well, I have the honor of being the president of something called the Tocqueville Society, which brings together academics from France and the United States. And the Tocqueville Society has a website, which is www.tocqueville21.com. I'll spell Tocqueville for those of your readers who may not be familiar with the great.
We'll put a link in the show notes so they don't need to Google while they listen.
spare me that necessity. So I blog there. I have been blogging quite frequently since the dissolution of Parliament, and I expect to continue to do so through the election. I've also been commissioned to write 2 articles for the New Republic. The first has already appeared. The second will appear after the second round. As often happens when there's a presidential election or a particularly dramatic election like this one in France, I'm invited to appear on TV and radio and podcasts like this one and others. So people who can Google my name will find where I'm speaking. But there are lots of other excellent people writing and blogging about French politics. So I would recommend certainly reading at least Le Monde if you read French, and Libération. The political scientist Philippe Marlière in England is following the election closely and appearing on X, formerly Twitter, quite frequently. So he's another good person to follow. The French radio personality Sylvain Bourmeau is doing the same, and many others I can name.
Fantastic. Well, this week I'm going to cheat and recommend 2. One is we haven't really discussed abortion rights in the US that much on this podcast so far. I'm sure after the UK election we'll pick that up. But this is from Stat News, and it's infant deaths increased after Texas banned abortion in early pregnancy. I just think it's important to remind our listeners of the consequences of political decisions in our country. And then the second one, just because we mentioned her quite a bit on this podcast, is in the piece in the Dial. It's called The Maloney Way, and it's how Italy's prime minister uses lawsuits and intimidation to reshape the culture. So I will put those in the show notes as well. Rohan, what do you have for our listeners?
We talk often about the left-right divides in our countries, and how there's pushback against parties that are, let's say, anti-immigration, sometimes anti-minority, and then the other side is pro-immigration or supportive at least of minority rights. I want to point to a piece appearing in Scroll.in by Harsh Mandar about India. Again, a reminder that although we tend to think of those binaries even with the Indian elections, the success of the right in India has meant that even the other side, the Congress, the parties that surprisingly did well in this election, didn't nominate all that many Muslims this time around because of the success of the ground that is being staged by the right. It's a piece called Indian Muslims and the Crisis of Non-Belonging. That's it for me today.
And Tom?
And I'm going to nominate a piece from The Guardian in the last week. I think probably all of our listeners, and I'm going to be nice to everyone who listens to this podcast, all of our listeners, I think, in our different electorates are high information voters who are paying a lot of attention to what's going on. But a lot of people aren't. And there was a really interesting piece in The Guardian which followed 6 people who are taking in election news via social media in particular, and just looking in some detail at what they're looking at, what news they're getting and what they're not getting, and how that's affecting their vote. So it's a piece by Jim Waterson called 5 Hours a Day on Facebook, How Voters Are Keeping Up with the Election. That had some really interesting little revelations about the kinds of things that you might assume that every UK voter is seeing, that in fact they're not seeing, and they're seeing other things entirely.
Great. Okay. Premium listeners, stick around. Rohan will be back. Premium listeners, stick around. Regular listeners, thank you for joining us. We'll be back next week, the day before the UK election, which I think will be exciting for all of us. But for now, Art Goldhammer, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.